Hi, Alexa. All right. Well, again, thank you all for being here, taking some time out of your Saturday. We appreciate it. This Evan Smith he's a hard act to follow, but I'll try my best. I'm Julian Aguilar. I'm the Border and Immigration Affairs reporter for the Texas Tribune. And I, unlike my boss, I think the Longhorns might, pull out an upset, and as well the Dallas Cowboys tomorrow night. So I just had to get that out of my system. So this, as Evan mentioned, this is there will be some overlap, obviously, because immigration overlaps in several areas. But this is going to concentrate more on federal immigration policy under Trump and obviously under Presidents Bush and Obama as well. Because just because one administration leaves doesn't mean the policies automatically change, as we've seen how difficult that can be. So I'll start with a quick introduction of my panelists. They'll be short, because I said earlier if I had to read their full bios, it'd probably take a good 20 minutes just to get over those, because they're very accomplished and we appreciate their being here with us. So I'll get started. Immediately to my left is Mr. Eddie Aldrete, who was nice enough to let me know one night that I misspelled his name 3 times in the story. So it's a good thing I'm not writing this one. But he is currently the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the National Immigration Forum and the Co-Chairman of the Texas-Mexico Trade Coalition. He's been the Senior Vice President of IBC Bank, International Bank of Commerce, since November of 2005. He's got more than 20 years of experience in communications, media relations, and political, governmental, and public affairs. To his left is Mr. Daniel Garza. He's the president of the Libre Initiative, which was founded in 2011, and it bills itself as a nonpartisan, nonprofit grassroots organization that advances the principles and values of economic freedom to empower the U.S. Hispanic community. He's also served under the George W. Bush administration, where he served as the Deputy Director of External and Intergovernmental Affairs in the Office of the Secretary of the Department of Interior. And in 2006, he became president of Televisa's Hispanic Poder Group, which oversaw editorial, commercial, and promotional publications. To his left is Sheriff Andy A.J. Louderback from Jackson County. He's got more than 35 years of law enforcement experience, and he's serving his 4th term as Sheriff of Jackson County. And the Sheriff said he's going to finish this term and maybe move on to higher office, so we'll see what he has in store in a couple of years. He's currently the Legislative Chairman for the Sheriff's Association of Texas and is the past president of that association. And he led the charge on the 287G program in the Gulf Bend region, recruiting several more counties to participate in that. And that's the program, which is a partnership with the federal government, which deputizes local and state officials to enforce immigration law. And last but not least is Selena Moreno. She's the interim Southwest Regional Counsel for Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, which was just announced early last month. Belated congratulations on the new assignment. And she is a veteran in the courts, and she's fought to, she's represented Dreamers against lawsuits that sought to invalidate Texas's DREAM Act, which is the in-state tuition bill, which Governor Rick Perry signed in 2001. It was the first state to actually allow in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants. And what a sea change we've seen since in those 16 years as far as policy and I guess the attitudes for that initiative. And she is also currently co-counsel for MALDEF's lawsuit in Texas, the Senate Bill 4, which I had the privilege of covering the oral arguments on that in New Orleans last week. So like I'm sure a lot of other people, I'm refreshing the Fifth Circuit page every morning to see if a decision is going to come down soon. So we'll definitely have a lively conversation after that happens. But again, a big round of applause for our panelists, and then we'll get started. So I want to start with what is, I think, one of the most well-known and maybe pressing issues, and there is a clock ticking on this, and this is federal policy. This is the DACA issue. This is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is a 2012 policy that was put into action by former President Obama, which he stressed was only eligible for not for new immigrants that are coming to the country. You have to be here within a certain time. And he admitted that it was a stopgap measure. He said this is a temporary fix, it's a Band-Aid, so to speak, until we get something passed. Obviously, I think a lot of those hopes were dashed for the young immigrant community with last year's election. But moving forward, the clock is ticking on the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And I want to speak to Mr. Aldrete about what he sees the prospects of any legislative fix, and absent that, what's going to be the economic hit for Texas if deferred action is done away with? I mean, these are kids that that start businesses, and they have college degrees, and they work, and they pay taxes. So I know that's kind of a broad question, but if you give me your best thoughts on how that's going to go moving forward.
Sure. Well, I think you heard on the previous panel that Texas has about 120,000 of the 800,000 DACA recipients. And so from that standpoint, I think Texas has the most to gain if we're able to solve this problem, and the most to lose if we can't solve the problem. The good news is Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina is taking the lead on a piece of legislation. He's gotten Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma and Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah to co-sponsor his bill. Senator Hatch was a leader on the DREAM Act previously, but as Senator Tillis has said repeatedly, the DREAM Act has been voted on 3 times, and 3 times it's failed. Right. So we know how that movie ends. So let's go in a different direction and try to pass something that that can pass and can get signed into law. So I know that we have a March deadline, but I'm relieved that the president has said he might be willing to extend that deadline if Congress can't get it done in time. The thing about Congress that we often forget about is they have legislative days and calendar days that are different from a normal calendar because they're not always in Washington.
Congress is not normal. That's
exactly. That's a good way to put it. So we know that between now and the end of the year, when you add Thanksgiving holiday and Christmas holiday and the fact that tax reform is on the front burner, right. Almost all other issues, because Congress, we've seen, sometimes has difficulty multitasking. But I feel good on the movement that we've seen so far on Senator Tillis's bill, both on the Senate and the House side, and the fact that he sat down with Senator Durbin from Illinois, and they're making progress together in a bipartisan fashion. I'm fairly cautiously optimistic.
Mr. Garza, if you could explain from the Libre perspective, you know, it was billed as something to empower the Hispanic population in the United States as far as free market, and how does that work in tandem with the undocumented population that has a temporary sort of protection? And what do you see moving forward for the business efforts to either save that, or if it is done away with, how are they going to rebound from the loss?
We believe in the talents of the individual, skills and the talents that people bring to bear to generate wealth, to generate prosperity and opportunity for everybody.
This is absent any status, any legal status?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course. As individuals, right. As human beings.
Right.
And for us, over the arc of history, we have seen that over 200 million immigrants have come to America and have made us richer, stronger, have strengthened America, have made us who we are, rich in the tapestry of diversity in culture and sports and food and politics and everything. And my dad was a dreamer. You know, he came in the 50s on the shoulders of his uncle across the Rio Grande. Back then, the farmer could sponsor you.
Right.
It was easier. There was flexibility. There was accommodation built into the system to address market forces and the need for labor and skill. And then those folks could assimilate quickly and then build their own dreams and businesses and create opportunities for others. That's been the American model forever.
Sure, but back
here
then,
we want to stunt that. You know, with dreamers who have come over through no fault of their own. I know it's a cliche, but it's absolutely true. They didn't decide to come. They were brought here by their parents. Somebody else made a decision to bring them here. Now, that somebody else was seeking opportunity. And people bring their labor and their hard work ethic, always have, to America. And we want to honor that. And so we want to pass some legislation. Right. We haven't set ourselves on one bill, whether it's Tillis or the House bills. What we want, we're working within a framework of something that is going to address market forces, work compassionately to accommodate for these young, talented, bright kids who we want to thrive in America and make us stronger like immigrants have before them. So in that sense, we're very open, and it does honor our free market perspective ideas.
Selena, you obviously, I just said that you work with a lot of dreamers on several different issues. So if there is no solution before March, and some dreamers, some DACA recipients are already losing their status, correct? So can you recap the numbers? How many a week across the country, and what options are they going to have if there's no fix? I mean, and I asked this because at one of the rallies in Austin, after the announcement was made, I spoke with a teacher. She was a public high school teacher for AISD, And I went back and I told some of my editors, and they were just astonished that somebody that doesn't have documentation other than DACA could actually educate U.S. citizens and immigrants alike. So that just kind of shows how sort of ingrained they are in society. But I asked for her phone number. I said, follow up, and she looked at me and she said, I'll let you know when I'm packing up my classroom. And she was already sort of thinking about moving back to Mexico. So absent some sort of fix, how many people are going to be like this school teacher that I just mentioned? What are the options that they have other than some sort of sponsorship or some sort of ability, or is that even a possibility to get some legal status after their DACA expires?
I think it depends on the facts of the individual person, but you brought up teachers. There's 20,000 people in the United States who have DACA who are teachers, 2,000 just here in Texas. We already have a shortage here in Texas of teachers who are can relate, have culturally relevant curriculum, can teach bilingual education. There's a major shortage. We have the alternative is not an option, and I think that's why you're seeing corporations across the country stand up and say we're going to protect these people. I mean, we're at a university. We're all in this together. The students here that have DACA are the next students that are going to be leading in the STEM fields. And so when people talk a lot about manufacturing and service industry and what happens, what does a day without a Mexican look like in those industries? But we should also be talking about what are our STEM fields, what are our other fields going to be looking at, because these are our leaders, especially in education.
Sheriff, there was a lot of talk when the migrant surge began in mass, that there was always folks coming over, specifically from Central America. And a lot of people, a lot of Republicans said, it was Obama's DACA policy that, prompted this, even though the president said you do not qualify if you're a recent arrival and things like that. In your experience, how many sheriffs or how many law enforcement officers that come across people that are in the country illegally say that DACA was a sort of a driving factor for them to migrate legally?
Well, thanks, Julian. There's a couple of things, though, that prior to your question that let me address. I think there's widespread support for trying to find a solution for the DACA problem.
Would you support a fix for DACA?
Yes, I think something has to be done about that. I think that there's some solutions that can be done. The core issue, though, has always been the fact that if you knowingly cross the border illegally, then your parents did a disservice to their children. And that's been one of the core issues that I have run into on the immigration circuit, and it's been a topic of discussion many times, is that the parents made a decision and knowingly violated the law and came over, and that's unfortunate. But I believe Congress, given the right incentives, can come up with a solution possibly to at least allow them to work, stay, give them some type of legal status here. I don't know that citizenship would be a part of that from Congress, but I do believe that the DACA recipients and the kids who came here, who are productive in this country and occupying great positions in education and so forth, and producers in this country, can certainly stay here.
With respect to the push, back to the original question though, because that was debated in the legislature, not only this recent session, but 2 years ago about the in-state tuition. They said, and some people would say, the last time I saw a 10-year-old Central American that was riding on top of a train, he wasn't talking about, I'm going to apply for this at UT Austin because I can get in-state tuition. They were running for their lives. So how much of that, in your experience on the street, talking to local folks, do you see that deferred action and the subsequent DAPA, which was eventually struck down, or never enacted, excuse me, how much of that was a sort of a motivating factor for these Central American kids? Or do you know, is there any data on that? Because that is a big talking point.
I don't know, and I don't have data or figures or stats for you on that. It's not really the DACA issue, other than who winds up committing a criminal action here in Texas. And I don't know those numbers as to that quantity on our DACA children who came over and then subsequently made a poor choice and committed a crime.
And I'll just the last thing on DACA, and then for whoever wants to answer, how much heat is the president going to take if he finds a legislative fix, if he urges his Republicans. I mean, there are some hardliners that says, no DACA, nothing, build the wall, we want it, and there's no black and white for him. I mean, the fact that the president has even said he's sympathetic to these children, whether you believe it or not, he got a lot of heat from his original supporters. So what is going to happen to the way the Republican supporters that ushered Donald Trump into office view him if there is some sort of compromise?
I would say that it was going to, if DACA is passed, if Dreamer legislation, DACA is one thing, Dreamer legislation is passed under his watch, it's going to be a net win for the president, with Republicans and Democrats. And I say that because even Joe Barton has said that if a bill hits the floor, he can count 300 votes for Dreamer legislation. There is massive, wide support across the country for Dreamer legislation. Now, that's the one issue where there is political will, where the two parties can reach a consensus on. Reconcile whatever the differences they have, whether it's a big, expansive Dreamer bill or one that's just for the DACA kids, whatever. The point is that if it happens under Donald Trump, it'll be a net win politically, if that's your question. Okay. That's my sense.
Okay. So the backlash will be, there will be some,
it'll be mitigated by,
of
course, the folks that are going to celebrate the decision.
Selena, would you send the president a thank you note if he managed to sign some sort of DACA legislation?
Well, first of all, I think his position is very unclear because I think first he said, don't worry, on the one hand, and then created this fantasy wish list of immigration provisions that need to go into any kind of bill that it would include Dreamer legislation, including rollbacks on the protection for unaccompanied minors. And so, on the one hand, he's saying we're going to support documented folks. On the other hand, we're going to these kids that you're talking about riding on top of trains. We're going to roll back the protections for those unaccompanied minors. And so, I don't think I would be sending a thank you note, and also I think it's very unclear what his position is.
Okay. I want to transition into something along those lines of what the president on his sort of immigration wish list was a lot more in enforcement. And he actually mentioned this before this sort of DACA wish list, for lack of a better term. But he wanted to ramp up the hiring of Border Patrol agents and ICE officers. And Sheriff, I want to talk to you about that because you work closely hand in hand with these folks. But there's been a lot of backlash, even from former federal officials, that says if you rush these people through the process, you're going to miss something on a background check. You're going to miss something, even with the lie detector tests. So how fast can the president and ICE and Border Patrol and CBP and all the other agencies, how fast can they hire even 5,000, much less 10,000, and do a good job and not have any sort of corruption or any sort of Border Patrol officers that, any bad seeds that slip through the ranks?
Well, case in point, the best example here is how long did it take the state of Texas to hire 250 troopers?
Right. Sure.
And it's for everyone in the law enforcement world, trying to hire, educate, go through the selection process. That's extremely time consuming. And not quick at all. Proper background check alone, that's possibly 3 months time. And in the federal world, which is different even than the state world, on their paperwork and requirements that they have, 5 years. I don't think he'd be there in 5 years.
I just want to add to sort of put those comments in context. There's a couple of things that are happening across the country. One of them is you have a smaller number of people that find law enforcement a good enough career that they want to move into that field.
Agreed.
So law enforcement across the country is struggling with that. On the local PD level, the Dallas Police Department, offers signing bonuses to SAPD officers, and now you see cannibalization going on between police departments. The other thing is, from a Border Patrol standpoint, in 2012, 52% of all Customs and Border Protection agents became eligible for retirement. Okay. So for every person that you go through the lengthy process to hire and to screen and to bring in, and you actually do hire, you got one walking out the door that's retiring. You combine that with, it takes about 18 months to truly train, and actually closer to 2 years once you put someone on the ground, a Border Patrol agent. Then what happens is you have people who might be from Montana and they get assigned to Presidio, Texas, and they don't like 117-degree weather and standing outside in the sun all day, so they choose to go elsewhere. The faster, and we've seen this repeatedly over history, the faster you try to hire Border Patrol agents, the more the corruption rate spikes. And Border Patrol and Customs have a severe problem with that.
Right, and even some Republicans have conceded that the process is not going to be as fast.
And
as
on top of that, we have the largest number of Border Patrol agents and the lowest number of apprehensions that we've had in modern history.
Right. But a lot of that is attributed to the rhetoric from the administration, where people just aren't taking the chance.
Well, it's that, and it's also economic factors in Mexico, because in Mexico for the past 5 to 10 years, their economy, their middle class was growing at a faster rate than ours. So you have the push-pull phenomenon. We may have jobs here, but their middle class is growing. And you also have to remember that in 1960, the Mexican fertility rate was 7.0, which means the average adult female was having 7 children. Today it's 2. So Mexico does not have the number of people that we can keep counting on for labor. We actually compete with Mexico for Guatemalan farm workers. So it's a matter of economics and demographics as well as rhetoric.
Another option, actually a current option, is the 287G program. This is where law enforcement, local and state law enforcement, undergoes training, and their powers are sort of expanded to enforce federal immigration law. Selena, I know MALDEF and other groups are big opponents of that. If you could explain what the problem with sort of deputizing local and state officials to enforce federal immigration law, because that was a lot of the criticism that people heard for SB4, which was local cops having to enforce immigration laws or know it when they have no training. So if you could just explain a little bit about what you see wrong with 287G, and then I'll turn to the sheriff to see why the program is good in his opinion.
Well, first I would say, even with 287G, there's under-training.
Okay.
But also, there's talk a lot about a force multiplier effect when you have people on the ground locally that can help federal immigration officers. I would say there's a multiplier effect in terms of liability as well, because you're going to see inevitably more lawsuits for Fourth Amendment violations, for racial profiling. And you're going to also see, just in our communities, we know that when local officers take the place of federal ICE agents, people are less likely to report crime, and that makes us less safe. And I think that particularly true, as was the case with SB4, you're tying these local officers to the policies of the Trump administration, which we've already mentioned. They're not just going after the most hardened Mara Salvatrucha gang members. They're going after now, in their executive order, anybody, even if you haven't been convicted of a crime, even if you haven't even been charged with the crime. And when you tie your local police force to such dangerous policies, you're going to see a very detrimental impact in our community.
If I could push back a little bit on that. I don't have any discrepancy with what she's saying. If I could actually add that under the Obama administration, statistics show that about 50% of the people that were deported had no criminal activity tied to them. So to say that that's a change from the Obama administration is a bit disingenuous.
Sheriff, you work with folks, you're a fan of this program. I'm not sure exactly how many counties currently use it. I know the numbers increased considerably. Your response to the criticisms of the program as you see it?
Let me correct some tremendous misinformation that is very consistent, and for anyone who's against 287G. Now 287G is only applicable in this country as a jail program.
Okay.
No one in the U.S. has law enforcement officers who are doing any kind of federal government immigration work outside of a jail setting. So a person who comes into jail for a local crime, DWI, assault, theft, any crime at all, then their status in the U.S., which is already checked, but 287G gives you an added layer of protection, gives you an added layer of efficiency, and it gives you the ability to work with all law enforcement agencies in this country. And those things are positives in our business for public safety. And 287G is a program that's been maligned with misinformation. There is no 287G tactical. Now, 16 years ago, there were several agencies who did, mainly in Arizona, who where local police departments and sheriff's offices could actually train someone in immigration, and they would wear the two hats, but in a patrol car. That program is not available and is not in function today. So we don't have 287G Tactical. What we do have, and in Texas you have 19 counties who are participants and federal partners with federal law enforcement, and we work with all law enforcement, whether it's FBI, DEA, BATF, ICE, any of those agencies, we work together because that's what the citizens are paying for in this country. That's a public safety issue.
If the program is, as you described it, it doesn't have any flaws and it's so sort of streamlined specific, then why aren't, I mean, there are 254 counties in Texas, why only, why less than 2 dozen?
Well, we were at 0 or 1 in Carrollton, and now we're at 19.
Right.
So it's certainly moving the other direction.
So do these counties just not really know about it, and you think as they get better informed, they'll adopt
Some
the
of them
policies?
Geographically, we're strong in 287G because we're on the pathway, on the direct drive route on US 59, the 77 corridor out of Mexico directly into Houston, which is the #1 human trafficking center in the U.S. So, geographically, it made sense for us to become involved in that program as a public safety issue, and that's what we've done. And the second thing is that I don't know of a sheriff one, and I don't know anybody in law enforcement that I personally know, and I've been in this business quite some time. No law enforcement agency, no law enforcement administrator is going out in their community and county and searching for illegal aliens. However, if they come into jail, then they'll be dealt with ICE. And that's a piece of information that probably needs to be talked about more and more. The fear that's been promoted about law enforcement going out and searching and finding illegal immigrants is simply, from our perspective, we look at that and say, gosh, you need to come work with us then. You need to come work with patrol.
I think it's also a damn shame that, that folks would begrudge law enforcement for executing law when the political decision has been made and they're the executors. I think what needs to happen is to obviously put the focus on the lawmakers. Look, in the 1920s, we passed a law. It was prohibition. Right. And we outlawed the production, distribution, and consumption of alcohol. And for want of a beer, millions of Americans were arrested, were oppressed. You would say what you want, right? Were they bad people? Some of them were. Obviously there was a criminal element, but the vast majority of them were good, decent people. It was just a bad law. Right. Here, millions have come to America, like the sheriff was saying, illegally, because there's no other option, and they're seeking opportunity for want of opportunity. And of course, are they all bad people? No, some of them are, right. Just like prohibition. But the vast, vast majority of them are good, hardworking, decent people. But our law, it's a bad law. It doesn't accommodate for market forces, for that kind of human element. People commercing, trading, trafficking through the Americas. That needs to change.
This is an important point because the prohibition example I equate to changing the speed limit on I-35 to 20 miles an hour. Okay.
Exactly.
And that's what we...
Parts of downtown Austin, that might help,
Yeah. That's what we have in this country right now in immigration law. Okay. What would happen is, just like in prohibition, you're going to have a lot of people that are going to violate the law. So does that mean we need more police officers and troopers to issue more citations? Right. Or does it mean we need to set the number of immigrants at a level that suits our economy and suits our needs in this country and our focus on what kind of immigration system that we want? And that's the one issue that Congress has not yet dealt with.
I want to switch gears a little bit, still talking about federal policy, but and I told Mr. Alderete I was going to bring this up. There was several years ago he was put on a panel at the Tribune Festival, and he had a clip. It was a 30-second clip from Family Guy, the cartoon. This is where Evan and I differ. He's got statistics, I got cartoons, but it was really, really funny, but it's actually really kind of like a serious note because the clip is it's a rancher somewhere out in the Southwest, could be Arizona, could be Texas, wherever, and there's and he's building a fence, and there's a Hispanic laborer that's trying to move the left side of the fence, and the guy has a shotgun. He's like, nope, and he moves to the right side of the fence. He's like, nope, and then the laborer just says, "You want help building the fence?" He's like, "All right, come on over." And it's funny, but it's the way things have worked for so long. And another example, after Hurricane Katrina, the Bush administration temporarily suspended the I-9 enforcement, and they said it was for people that were affected by the storm. They might not have their documents, so they could still get work, but it was really wink, wink, nudge, nudge to, hey, Central Americans, Hispanics, we need you to rebuild the city. It's hot. We need people to work outside. And from my understanding, the population of Central Americans and Hispanics overall in Louisiana exploded after Katrina, and a lot of them are still there. But fast forward, now part of the so-called wish list is mandatory E-Verify expanding across the board. The state legislature doesn't really have an appetite for E-Verify for the private sector. They say it's big government, it wouldn't be good. But how realistic now under the Trump administration is something as vast as E-Verify looking like a possibility from what you understand, from what you've heard from all the discussions that have been had since the last, I guess, 10.5 months?
Whether it's E-Verify or it's something else, a business wants something to be able to say, we have checked the list, right. We have checked that box, and now we want to fill this position, and we want to do what we do best in building widgets or whatever it is that they do. So something is critical. The problem in the previous panel, Evan made the comparison to the no-fly list. Right. The no-fly list for TSA became a dumping ground for CYA. Cover your rear end. And a lot of people got thrown in there. Even 10 years after Saddam Hussein had been killed, he was still on the no-fly list. So that's the challenge that people have. You have Americans who get caught up in that system. They're second, third generation Americans. But for whatever reason, their name is similar to somebody else's name, and they get prevented from accepting a job and from being hired. So that's the challenge with a government system that isn't down pat, that hasn't been fixed.
How much of a hit, Mr. Costa, if there would be a hit at all? I mean, how much would the economy lose out if all of a sudden you had to? And from what I understand, you can't go back and E-Verify current employees, but even the new employees. Would that be a deterrent? And where would the labor come from if these folks weren't able to get hired?
Well, that's part of the challenge. On the one hand, we want to let those folks in who are going to make America stronger, right, and make us thrive, right? And then keep those out that would do us harm. Of course, everybody agrees with that. What kind of systems do we have in place to assure for that? Domestic enforcement is a tricky one for a classic liberal like me, because I don't like the government coming in through the back doors of businesses, going through your records and sticking their nose in somebody's business. So you have to reconcile that with, we also want to keep America secure, and that person is who they say they are, and of course that they are compliant with the rule of law. Sometimes you don't agree with the law, like immigration law, but that's the law we have, and until it changes, that's the law we live under, and there has to be rule of law. Is E-Verify that system? I don't know. I haven't studied it enough, but I know there would be an impact, and I know that I was raised a farm worker. My parents came from Mexico as farm workers in California. I was born in Dinuba, California, and then traveled up to the state of Washington. I can count on one hand the number of non-Latinos I saw in the fields. There's about 3 million Latinos who work in the fields. It's an essential workforce, and they're good, decent, noble people who are doing the Lord's work. And once they move on and up, like I did and my parents did, who's going to replace them? So we need to have that flexibility, that accommodation for folks that are going to come and do that. Somebody needs to do that.
The flip side of that argument was if you have some sort of like a modern bracero program or a guest worker program, then that opens up the door to exploit these workers. Selena, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, but that's a common criticism, right? The federal government said, like, well, let's have a guest worker program, but then that opens it up to to wage theft or to intimidation, things like that. I mean, is there something that advocates for immigrants, whether here lawfully or not, would be happy with on a guest worker type of level, where these people were able to get hired and do these jobs and then maybe stay around or come back and forth? I mean, what do you think is the best solution to not exploit workers, but also to give them some sort of legal status to fill these jobs that apparently nobody else wants to do?
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think if you were to go to Mexico, a lot of people do want to come and return.
Right.
and not necessarily stay, but because of this very heightened immigration system that has been created over the last several decades, that's been made impossible. But for the people that do want to stay and are joining their families, I think we need to remember that the number one principle of our U.S. immigration system is the reunification of families, is keeping families together. And so I think to the extent that there are workers that want to stay, I think we should recognize that they are a central part of our workforce and provide them a legal pathway to stay and ensure that they are not exploited. I think it's also interesting that when we talk about a free flow of money, it's sad when there's a freer flow of money than there is of people. And so I think that's something that we need to be cognizant about.
Selena brings up a very interesting point that most people forget about, is that the phrase circularity. We used to have a pattern where Mexican laborers would come here, they'd work a harvest, they might move upstate as the climate changes, work a different crop, and then they would go home. As we slowly began to militarize our border, that made it more difficult, and it cut off circularity. So a lot of immigrants began staying here, domiciling here, and having families here. And so in some instances, we made the problem worse as a country. And then regarding labor, we prided ourselves on NAFTA, and we created the exchange of everything except for the movement of labor back and forth.
Yeah. Sheriff, last question on this issue. I mean, you're for the rule of law. You're talking about street crime, and this isn't street crime, but it is illegal to hire people in the country without authorization. So, would you be fine in Jackson County or the surrounding areas if there was a crackdown on employers, whatever their party affiliation, whatever their status, being reprimanded for hiring people they know are in the country illegally?
I think E-Verify is a program that's that is a part of what we need to do. But the core issue here is and has always been, how do we handle this? And it's enforcement plus legalization. And until this country addresses the enforcement part, if you're going to get buy-in politically, if you want the Democrats and Republicans to come together, then you're looking for enforcement plus legalization in this country. That's going to be your answer as to how we solve this issue.
And I would reverse that order because we have, in the United States, we spend more money on immigration enforcement than all other federal law enforcement combined. You add FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and every other agency, and we still spend more on immigration enforcement. And my issue is, again, if you fix the speed limit and you fix the number of people that we need in this country, whether it's to reunite families or whether it's to fill jobs, then people won't be violating the law, and therefore you won't need to double or triple the Border Patrol.
Let me add, the problem in '86 was that we did the legalization part, but we didn't do the enforcement correctly. Right. So now we have the political issue that we're having to deal with.
It was a one-time fix that was not a permanent solution.
That did not work out well in the country. So,
if I could add something else to the circularity and that kind of issue, I don't care what a politician's dream is or what their politician's aspirations are for me or for anybody else. I believe in the power of the individual. And I believe that the individual must be sovereign in controlling their own destiny. And that includes documented, undocumented, Mexican, American, I don't care. I think as individuals, God has given us amazing talents, and we have to bring to bear in the marketplace those talents in our societies, in our communities, in our churches, with our colleagues. And for us to accept an immigration policy for the 11 million, whether it's a worker visa program or a path straight to citizenship, which we'd be comfortable with either way, because I'm telling you, we sort of take a pragmatic approach. What is politically viable? If path to citizenship isn't, then what's the next best thing? And for us, anything that honors the sovereignty of the individual is critical. So what I mean by that, circularity is important. That someone can go to and from their country of origin for whatever reason, whenever they want. Whether it's a quinceañera or a death in the family, or just because they have money and they can go take a vacation. Job mobility is important, that you not tie one person to any one employer. That's servitude. That they're able to jump from one job or one opportunity to another, or give them at least 3 months to, if they're fired, find another job, or create their own business, so that there's opportunity. Third, and it's important that family unification. that the person who's granted the visa gets to have their immediate family with them. And look, I agree with the issue of fairness. It's not fair that you put him in front of the folks that have been waiting in line. Okay, but don't keep him from getting at least in back of the line. That they actually have a shot at citizenship at one point. But to cut off citizenship or any possibility of it is anti-American for me.
Do they, and I'm going to ask if is it wrong to assume that everybody that wants to stay here and live here legally, be an LPR, legal permanent resident, eventually wants to be a citizen? I mean, do all immigrants want citizenship?
No, there's a chunk of, my parents always wanted to go back to Mexico.
Right.
They're living now back in Mexico. They became American citizens after Proposition 187. Because, they put the fear of God into them. They said, well, I don't want any issues. But, so they became citizens. And I had a straight ticket because I was born here.
Right.
But the point is, their intent was always to go back. Okay. And there are plenty of immigrants who believe in the circularity model and at some point want to go and retire back in their country of origin.
Because I think that, and I asked that question because that gets caught up in sort of the debate, like, right, oh, you want to legalize all these folks, and all of a sudden they're going to vote for Democrats, which obviously in the last panel we saw not all Latinos, vote. It's not a monolithic voting bloc. But anyway, I just thought that was an important issue. The last thing I wanted to get to before I give you all the heads up that we're going to start asking questions is about ICE detainers. I know we talked about SB4 a lot in the first panel, but the ICE detainers, there's been a lot of I guess, debate over whether those are warrants, what effect they have, whether those are unconstitutional. And as a matter of fact, the first district judge, Orlando Garcia, that enjoined most parts of SB4, that was part that was put on hold, was the mandatory ICE detainer provision. Whereas I think for what a lot of people felt was the most egregious part, the so-called papers, please, which allows local officers to question the status of anybody they detain or they arrest, he didn't block that provision. So it gets I think the ICE detainers get to the heart of it. And Selena, I want to ask you, can the president just not sign an executive order making ICE detainers official warrants, and then that would make the debate go away? Or is it not that easy? If you could explain the nuance about ICE detainers and the way Maldiv sees it.
Sure. So even when ICE detainers are accompanied by a warrant, it's an administrative warrant. It's not a warrant issued by a judge, a neutral party. Okay. I would say that an ICE agent or the Trump administration is not a neutral party when it's trying to to ask a jurisdiction to hold somebody. And so I think here, and I want to push back a little bit back to 287G, what you're going to see is that you're going to continue to see Fourth Amendment violations. So when you're in the jail and you're holding somebody when they would otherwise be able to be released out on bond, you are infringing on their constitutional rights. And so I think that is why you saw the judge block that provision, and even the Fifth Circuit in a temporary ruling said, okay, well, we're going to let this provision go through, but only to the extent that it doesn't violate federal law
that it currently exists,
current ICE practice, which current practice is voluntary. So to say that ICE detainers are somehow the rule of law, well, the rule of law right now at the federal level is that it is a voluntary program.
Sheriff, in your experience, have you come across any one example, 5 examples of somebody that alleges that they were held longer, or that was actually proven, or they got some sort of they were awarded some sort of I guess relief because they were held longer because of an ICE detainer?
Yeah, I think there's been some mistakes. We're up to 48 hours awaiting ICE removal from the facility has been violated. Here in Texas, commonly 1 minute after that 48-hour limit, we release. The correctional center that I run and the other sheriffs run, we don't hold anyone over that. And, as a 287G partner, obviously they're there within a couple of hours for me. And they're sometimes even actually before that. But one of the issues that's always concerned law enforcement about that, the INA did not include judicial review for detainers. It did not. That was on purpose. This is a national security issue for our border issue on the Immigration and Naturalization Act. So the federal government's position on this, and many years prior, on the tens and hundreds of thousands of detainers that we have done without any legal challenge, all of a sudden now today we have legal challenges from that. So is there going to be a change? I think ICE is working today on trying to come up with some solutions. I've been involved in several of those conversations in several committees that are trying to trying to work through the different civil aspects on the suits and so forth that are being brought about illegal detainers. But the INA states we have 48 hours, up to 48 hours to hold, and if they're not there, we release, and that's what we do.
Folks, I'm going to ask one last question and start taking questions from you all, so you guys want to start lining up. And I apologize that the last question is about the wall. I should have started off with the wall, because we could spend 5 hours on it. But if you guys, I'm just going to go up and down the line. Just give me a quick 30, 45-second opinion analysis. What do you think of the wall? There's 8 prototypes that have been rolled out. They're 30 feet tall. If you go down Military Highway in Cameron County, there's already a fence. People don't like it. If you look at Sun Bowl Stadium and imagine the 30-foot, in El Paso, Texas, imagine a 30-foot wall that's blocking the view that's been there for decades, centuries, if not. It might happen. It could not happen. Where do you see that situation now, and what do you think of it personally?
Well, first of all, a lot of the fencing and the walls that we have in Texas today are not on the border.
Right.
The border is down the middle of the Rio Grande.
Sure.
In some cases, in Cameron and Hidalgo County and in Maverick County, the wall is 2 to 3 miles inland.
Right.
Texans shed blood for that land over the course of years, and Tejanos did as well many years earlier. There's a major private property rights issue that we have to be concerned with, but more important than any of that is it violates the #1 desire of the Border Patrol, and that is to maintain visibility of the water line and the riverbank and to maintain access, and that will not achieve that.
So I'll try to be quick. I've had conversations with border agents, and I won't mention names, but they say that from Las Peñitas to La Joya, which is about a 10-mile space of wall with McAllen in the middle, they got all the assets. Headquarters, the shift changes, they have the quad runners, the SUVs, the helicopters, the boats, all the assets. You have all the personnel. 1,000 people a day get through. That's 30,000 a month. That's 100 and whatever. I don't know how much that works out to. We got to do the quick math, but that's a porous border with a wall that's 25 foot. So I'm indifferent to the wall. If you have a sense of security about a wall and you want to build it, go for it. Spend the money.
The current walls, you have it like in Cameron on Oklahoma Avenue, you have it where it's 2 miles, and then you'll have a half-mile
Huge
gap.
gaps. Then
right?
you have, of course, barriers for cars.
And
when
trying to get
animals
answers.
migrate. You
Right.
can't stop animals from migrating either.
Right.
So, I mean, yeah, if it gives you the illusion of security, fine, build a wall.
Sheriff?
Even Europe, and I don't call it a wall personally. I'm a fan of fencing, clear fencing. San Diego put up fencing, reduced their issues 90%.
Right.
Norway building fencing. Many, Bulgaria, many European countries building fencing. History, go back to the Bible. Walls did what? They protected. They kept people out. They didn't actually keep people in, it's not a prison. So they work. They've been effective. But I do like a combination of fencing, and I do like a combination of technology. Those two things.
Selena?
I think it's a ridiculous waste of taxpayer money. There's all this taxpayer federal dollars used down at the borderlands to protect wildlife.
Right.
And now that all of that money that was used to protect wildlife, animals, yes, now are where there's a wall, are not getting through. But the studies have shown that people are still getting through. And what does that mean? People are still getting through, but they're doing so in much more dangerous conditions. And so I think it becomes a humanitarian issue. So for me, it's not just like, oh, if you want the illusion of security. No, there's some real consequences to having this wall from a humanitarian perspective. But I think bottom line, it's a ridiculous waste of resources, and it's also a ridiculous message when you're trying to have bilateral relations with your southern border. That's a pretty strong message to Mexico as a neighbor. If you want to have bilateral relations, having a literal physical border is just ridiculous.
And can I just add one thing real quick? If you ask the U.S. Department of Homeland Security who works with you the closest on helping to secure the border, and they will tell you Mexico. Cooperation is key.
Right. Ma'am, I'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Hilda Gomez, and my background is I was a bilingual teacher in California for about 20 years, and before that I was a journalist. And I'd like to ask you about two issues. And one is, do you agree that our government's approach to immigration is kind of like putting the cart in front of the horse, in that they look at building walls, and their approach is mostly reactionary? and that instead of looking at the immigration process, which people have complained about for years, and that it does not allow due process for all individuals. Sheriff, you mentioned that people are breaking the law to come over here. The fact is, they don't have a path. We know that the categories are if you have family, if you have been offered a specific job, and technically those have been offered with people with advanced degrees. But if you're an unskilled worker, if you don't have family here, if you're not seeking asylum, there really is no path for you. So people are looking for a process, and they don't have a process. So until the federal government starts looking at truly reforming immigration law, then you will continue to have law enforcement issues that by and large will be focusing on documentation.
What is the question, ma'am? I'm sorry. for getting the
Do
question
you
quick.
agree with this, that we should be focusing on immigration process and not on building walls? And my second issue is, do you agree that our government has to take responsibility for developing programs like NAFTA and the Maquiladora programs that worked as magnets to attract people from the interior of Mexico to those plants along the border, then use discriminatory hiring practices that focused it on women instead of men, and then push those people to come into our country looking for jobs?
Ma'am, I'm going to stop you right there. And Eddie, I'm going to give you the NAFTA question because this has been an issue, and we talked about it at Tribune Fest. I mean, the push and pull of NAFTA. I mean, your answer to her comments about NAFTA and what that does and how that affects the migration to the border in the cities.
No, absolutely. So one of the things I mentioned earlier was that we created NAFTA. People forget we created NAFTA to create a much stronger trading bloc within North America to be able to compete with the European Union and to compete with Asia. We now have that. There's a lot of anxiety right now as we sit here today. It's round 5 of the NAFTA negotiations in Mexico City. But as I mentioned, the one component that was left out was the ability to move labor. When you go to the European Union, once you get in the Union, and it's now going to be less of a European Union with Brexit, but you can move from country to country a lot easier, and I'm not suggesting that we model that, program that they have. But I do think we're largely lacking. And here's the bottom line. I'm going to sum it up for you. It's not a cartoon, but it does make people think, and it puts it in context. 3 years ago in Japan, adult diapers began to outsell baby diapers because their country is aging at such a high rate. We're on that same path. We have been declining in fertility since the birth of the nation, with one exception, the post-World War II baby boom. We're struggling to find people in almost every single industry. And what we're now hearing from economists and demographers is that the #1 job field over the next 20, 30 years is going to be in healthcare, because as all the baby boomers begin to retire, they're the largest consumer of healthcare services. So it's an issue that we have to come to grips with. If you look at Canada, they spend less on border security than they spend on recruitment. They go and travel the world and find the nuclear physicists and the landscapers and the brain surgeons and all the people they need to fill the jobs that they need, and we're not doing that. We're in a global race for talent, and our Congress has refused to recognize that so far.
Sir?
My name is Terry Burton. I'm from New Braunfels. And I guess my question specifically, I'll lead in. Our daughter this year was stopped for going 5 miles over the speed limit. And in that process, she was asked for a social security number, and she was asked for her birthplace. This was in Comal County. And I don't know if it's a 287G. I made that assumption. My question is, do we feel like citizens' rights and the fear that immigrants would have of being stopped for a broken taillight is accentuated by 287G or SB4 type programs?
Selena, Sheriff? Anyone
I
want
would
to?
say absolutely. So 2/3 of young people in this state are people of color. And you're going to see more and more their constitutional rights being affected. There's already a sense of fear and confusion in the community. And it's not just among undocumented immigrants. I think what happened the last day of the legislative session on the House floor, where a duly elected representative did exactly what we were warning against with SB4 in terms of racial profiling, looked up to a sea of people, U.S. citizens, immigrants, and just automatically assumed that they were all undocumented and called ICE on them. I think I think you're exactly right. It's going to affect all Texans, not just people who are undocumented.
This is State Representative Matt Rinaldi who got into an altercation after protesters flooded the gallery, and like a lot of people allege that he saw a bunch of brown people and he thought, okay, well, they're all in the country illegally. Sheriff, if you want.
Let me make sure I understand your question first. And I do not understand the constitutional issue that we have here. And 287G is not a factor in that. 287G does not exist at the patrol level. So the traffic violation that your daughter was stopped for was not a 287G issue at all. It can't be even confused or talked about in that sense. And also the issue with asking for status, we've been able to do that in Texas law enforcement since the Arizona decision that was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. So everybody in this country, every law enforcement agency in this country, every person that's stopped can ask, we can ask their status in this country.
And do they have to answer?
No, they don't have to answer.
Okay. So if you're
And
asking,
can we do anything about it as a Texas peace officer? Can we do anything about it? They say, I'm here illegally. I'm from Syria. I'm here illegally. What can a Texas peace officer do in almost any Texas county that we have? We don't have ICE agents that are in our counties. 80% of this state is rural. We don't have ICE agents in our counties. They're not driving around. They're not on patrol in our counties, trust me. So what do we do as a Texas peace officer when we find someone who's here illegally? We have no authority whatsoever. We have no authority. We're not Texas, as Texas peace officers, we're not immigration officers with federal statutes. We do not have that authority. Part of the misinformation I talked about earlier is exactly what I'm saying today.
well, I agree. And I appreciate you expressing that, because I would like to think that a police officer who stops someone, asks them their social security number, which tells them whether they are documented or on green card or not green card, we could go with that. Birthplace tells them whether they were born in Mexico or some other place. Just those questions are before you're even asking for papers, you know at that point you have a lead in towards asking for papers. And if that's on every ticket that is given out, we're profiling just by stopping somebody with a taillight.
Can I say something really quick on that? As a former law enforcement officer, I was trained to ask for identification at a traffic stop, on a Terry stop, on any reasonable cause to stop somebody.
Right.
It's not the issue that he was here illegally. The issue is that he provided an ID that was a fraudulent ID, and that was the crime. So sometimes it's the circumstances are different. It's not the immigration issue. It's that you're actually carrying a fraudulent ID.
And I guess the fear is that everybody is feeling that you're asking questions like social security number and birthplace that have with a valid ID in your hand, you'll still be asked things that go beyond that ID.
Sir, I'm gonna thank you for your question. I appreciate it, and get to the one last question there. You've been very patient. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Lauren Sage. I live here in San Antonio, and I really like the idea of circularity and looking for that we need immigrants, that we need both labor and job creators. One issue that came up last night was the idea that immigrants strain our systems, whether it be healthcare or any system like that. And so I just thought, maybe as a brainstorm question, what are some solutions to maybe if you see them as guests, if they're just circulating through, if they want to come here and work and offer their intelligence, how do we support them in our systems and getting them what they need, and in life, or how do you, if you want to increase the number of allowed immigrants, can we consider those pros and cons? Because I think some people do think that there are cons to increasing that number.
So as the question, my understanding is, if you have some sort of circular migration and guest workers that are here legally, but they're not available
Right, so
to
what
tap
are-
into resources.
Right, like, so how do we provide them resources? How do, maybe just some brainstorming on what our
Can I say
responses
part of the
are.
incoherence in the Latino community is that Latino activists will not accept legalization. They want a path to citizenship.
It's all or nothing.
But the immigrants themselves overwhelmingly would accept legalization and the legalization bill. Back in '86, when IRCA was passed, the Immigration Reform Control Act under Reagan, it absorbed the 3 million that at the time were here without documentation. And what was supposed to happen immediately after that, they were going to clamp down on enforcement, and there were going to be no more illegal flow of immigrants. That was the concept.
Right.
Of course, that was shattered immediately because they never got to the enforcement part of it, and so we spiked up the numbers up to now 11 million.
So is what you're saying that, would a lot of immigrants be okay with a status that's not citizenship and maybe limited access to public resources?
So optimal, ideally, what we would like to see is a bill that would include at some point a path to citizenship. But again, if that is not politically viable right now because of the situation, the president, whatever, then we are willing to consider what's the next best thing.
Okay.
And so, because you have to accommodate for the reality of the circumstances and what people are going through, I thought it was ironic that Latino activists on the left celebrated the DAPA, which was a temporary legalization, but. Oh my God, we cannot accept a permanent legalization program. There's some sort of incoherency there, especially when the community wanted it. What we're saying is we need to consider that, if that's an option.
The compromise is a four-letter word, I guess. Sure.
So one thing is that no company or no country is built on a foundation of stagnation or decline. They're all based on growth. And we have to have people keep coming here because our job keeps creating, our economy keeps creating jobs. And if you look at the population pyramid, my family's not, well, they're not normal, but they're not average. But my father was one of 11, my mother was one of 11, I'm one of 5, my wife is one of 5, and we have 3, and today 3 is above the norm, and you have to have 2.1. So we constantly need people in this economy.
Folks, that's all we have time for, but thank you all very much for sticking with us, and we're going to applause.